Welcome to Simmons Says, where I help emerging and struggling writers create intriguing plots and compelling characters to make their stories hard to put down and even harder to forget. In the first part, I talked about curiosity. But this next segment, I get a bit more personal because curiosity may start the journey, but other things like humor are what help you endure it. I've always been playful, always. I've always been a joker. As a matter of fact, one of the ways that I made friends or dealt with meeting new people and being in places where I felt a little out of place was through humor. Right. I've always been, as I said, a character type, the Jester. So humor and playfulness saved me from embarrassment from time to time because I wasn't sure enough to do certain things. So I could playfully attempt them. And if they went awry, then it was a joke, right? It was funny. I was goofing. It could be laughed off, right? Or at least I could make it look like it was a funny thing so they wouldn't take it seriously and so I wouldn't be embarrassed. Now, my discovering how I work also feeds me information about how other characters might also work. But also, meeting tough situations, finding the humor in them, the laughter in them, the energy that helped me get through those difficult moments, that was powerful too. It was consistent for me. It was easier than being angry or storing up resentment or having to always be stoic. Right? I could find some humor in it and smile and feel a little better about the thing and move forward again. Indignity. Being a young black kid in a poor family, being raised by a single parent who was very sickly, that in and of itself wasn't a horrible scenario. Mom was great. She was. My mother was fantastic in so many ways. But being in what was considered at the time the intelligent and gifted class, I wasn't surrounded by a lot of people who were going through what I was going through. I was surrounded by classmates who had two parents, who had their own homes, their own rooms, who lived in fine apartments, who got to go on vacations, who got to travel and had, extended families of aunts and uncles and cousins and all of that sort of thing. I wasn't there. I wasn't living that life. I wasn't doing straight A's, but I was holding my own. Right? But I wasn't, the top academic student. So I stood out. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned that in several of those classes, I was the only black kid. Right? There was some white, Jewish, Chinese, Japanese, but I was the only black kid, the only African American kid. So once again, I stood out. And that made me feel more comfortable being playful, being humorous, being the Jester. I was that imaginative kid. I could make up stuff, right? But you don't want to stand out all the time. Because sometimes what I had to show, what they saw when they looked at me, it wasn't shining. It wasn't the way their lives were shining. It wasn't the events and the experiences they were having. My things were more limited. And sometimes I didn't want them to see that. So sometimes indignity was a companion. That leads to challenges. By now, you've had enough examples of some of those, mine and others, right? So let's move on to memories. Places I lived, experiences with my grandparents and my mom, my friends, places I traveled to, things I heard, cartoons that I watched, regular movies and TV shows that were my favorites, foreign films, which I was interested in at a very early age, British, Chinese, Japanese, French. I found foreign films fascinating because it showed me some other parts of the world, some other lifestyles that were different or similar. And that was fascinating to me, stimulated my curiosity. Remember that once when I was 11 years old, a famed news columnist, famous at the time, Walter Winchell, stood in my living quarters talking to my mother about an incident, a crime that had happened in the building. I knew who Walter Winchell was. I didn't know him personally. I just knew who he was from watching television, from seeing the news items and things like that. And here was this man standing in my room. What are the odds? There was no big scandal going on then. There was no mob event taking place. But for some reason, that man was there in my house. And that was the beginning of me realizing that maybe ordinary people can sometimes find themselves in extraordinary situations or in the proximity of extraordinary people. The boundaries were starting to break down a bit. At some point, you realize you're not just collecting experiences, you're carrying them. And what you carry eventually becomes story. And that's where we're going next in part 3. See you then.